I will now ask Rahul, Govind to offer us.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Not Yeah. Thank you, Nidhi, for sort of inviting me to participate in this. It's I can assure everyone here that it's very difficult to discuss this book in 10 to 12 minutes, but I'll try, and I'll try by focusing on the first couple of chapters and perhaps the later chapter on land and capitalism. Sorry, I should also mention I thank JNU Academic for organizing this. I think it's really wonderful to have a student forum, organizing events such as this. So let me quickly try to pick up just a few threads from some of the arguments in the text. It's a very rich, wide-ranging text, and then offer a kind of commentary or critique of some of those points. So as I think, as maybe some of it might overlap with what has just been said, but I think it's useful that since it's there in the subtitle, the sort of Global South, the way in which the book is framed, it seemed to me, as I said very early on, there is a critique of Eurocentrism that is central, that is seen as having already been accomplished to a very large extent. Then the second task that the book poses is to kind of critique the West and the non-West binary by asking that we show in what way there are intervening concepts that lie under these two, under this distinction. And then the third task, which is stated very early on, is to find concepts internal to sort of non-West traditions and see to what extent they can travel around. And then there is a move to, there's a very strong critique of the idea of the state and the nation state. There is the sense in which, as has just been discussed, that the idea of secularism appears to take religion as a self-evident category. And what is suggested throughout is that there is actually a co-constitution of the political and the religious. Now, another, on the secular, there is also kind of argument made, and one can discuss how this sits with the larger critique, that there is a kind of Indian version of secularism, which is more linked with the question of diversity, which is, so this linkage with diversity and the question of minorities is in some ways supposed to have sort of anticipated debates around multiculturalism in the West that took place at a much later point in time. And at one point, the text suggests that secularism, there are two meanings of secularism. One is adjudicating between distinct and different religious communities, and the second is about sort of acquiring justice for members within a religious community. And what's interesting, I'll later say where I disagree with this line of argument. The text seems to suggest that the second aspect of secularism is not what we usually associate with classic secularism, because the argument is made that the classic version of secularism is something that is opposed to religion. So the idea of acquiring justice within religious communities is apparently not part of what we essentially understand or what is historically constituted itself as secularism. After this, there is a strong argument. I mean, the text characterizes the current sort of dominant phase as Hindu supremacist, and there are certain distinctive features that are culled from this phase that are seen to be, in some sense, different from what happened in the 1990s. But interestingly, there is also, as was just suggested, that on the one hand, there is a very distinctive set of features associated with the current phase, but on the other hand, this is also seen as part of a almost more than a double sort of millennial project that is outlined in one of the chapters. So in some ways there are very deep continuities, and sometimes the word used is Brahmanism. But on the other hand, there are also some very specific features of the current phase that is characterized as Hindu supremacist, which is seen to be a more apt way of characterizing what one is experiencing today compared to earlier terms like communalism and other such terms. An important critique of secularism, again, as was just said, is that it is seen to obscure the question of caste, and that's an issue I'll take up later, because in some ways this is connected with the point that I just made about secularism apparently not taking up the question of justice within religious communities. The other running thread is again about linking up with some of the previous points, that the question, I mean, at one point the book, actually I think I left my book there, so I can't, yeah. But there's a line which suggests somewhere that actually sort of neither religious nor religious belief is at stake. And very strongly put that at this moment it is neither religious nor religious belief that is at stake, if it ever was. So there's a certain way in which, and this is of course a very important part of the broader argument, that in some way the focus on religion kind of is not the way in which we can really understand what is taking place today. And I mean, in that context, there is an argument also made about some of the important organizations, such as the RSS, is not a religious body, but it is a political body. So there's a certain way of understanding religion and politics. That's something else that we can talk about. And then finally, the very strong. I mean, this might be sort of more. I'll have to move more quickly, but later on in the arguments about sort of capitalism and individual rights, there is a set of arguments made that links secularism with almost necessarily with a sort of developmentalist discourse that is seen as sort of leading to a lot of the violence that's associated with several developmental sort of projects, and that the kind of state, the rationale for that is seen as part of the logic of secularism. And in the same way, the question of individual rights to land is itself seen as, in some sense, a capitalist strategy. So it's part of the commercialization of land, and the critique that the book takes is that this commercialization of land should be distinguished from existing forms of living and livelihood where spirituality and nature are sacralized in a particular way, and sort of implied, of course, is the fact that the sacralization of nature might in some ways preempt or prevent the commercialization that's sort of associated with capitalism. So these are some of the threads that I will quickly sort of raise a few sort of questions about. The first point, again, I wish to make, but this is at a broader methodological kind of level, is, I mean, at least I certainly think one needs to think more about this critique of universality and what does really universality mean. Particularly when, for instance, the terms that are used are names, are nominal. So, I mean, I think So when one talks about the West or the non-West, despite the fact that, of course, the book is critical of these distinctions, there's a certain role that these names play. And so when what is Indian, I think along with the nominal, there has to be some kind of epistemic measure. When we say that we need to have sort of theories from elsewhere, what does one literally mean by the elsewhere? I mean, is this purely spatial, that if we get more theories from one place, we should have theories from another place, or is there any value given to what the theory is meant to accomplish in the first place? So the question of theory and place, I think, is something that's well worth sort of investigating further. The second point, although I completely sort of agree with the fact that, so on the one hand, I completely agree with the fact that the argument in the book is about treating the problem of secularism more broadly, and I think that's essential. But I would argue that modern secularism or contemporary secularism or our constitutional understanding of secularism means that the idea of secularism has to be linked with notions of rights, popular sovereignty, a certain notion of adjudication and law. So in a sense, the question of the secular has to be linked with a constellation of concepts. So I mean, in that sense, the idea that, say, Akbar was secular, to my mind, just is a meaningless statement, because a monarch can't be secular meaningfully in the contemporary context. So the idea, so any attempt to find analogies of religious neutrality with the contemporary constitutional and experienced understanding of secularism, to my mind, has to confront the issue that secularism is meaningful today only with a whole set of other norms. Without that, there is simply no way one can draw analogies of different sorts. And I think this is very clearly articulated, for instance, in the Constitution, where when it says "we the people," there is almost a necessary indetermination to the "we." It's not just that there's no invocation of God, but there's no invocation of any identity or tradition. So there is an essential, that aspect of what it means to be is, I think, important. I mean, that is in some senses what we might understand to be secular. Second, I think historically, if you want to look at the question of secular, and this is where perhaps there is, and in that I should say, when one is talking about that, so when the book is critiquing the category of the state, I would in some ways wish for a more, a more discriminatory reading of the state, as it were. That distinctions should be made between modern states, notwithstanding, so we can have a critique of the modern state, but we understand what the modern state. Of course, modern state, in the sense, if you're talking about democratic states, whatever kinds of states that we're talking about. And then when one is critiquing that, one has an understanding of different kinds of states. So we need to characterize the state or the nation state at the same time as we critique it. So when one is talking about state and community, the categorization of community has to be more precisely formulated in terms of what are we talking about when we talk about community. That's one point. The second point is, I just take a couple more. The second point is that the idea, I think to my mind, the idea of the secular is that it has historically, it's not taken religion for granted, that it has historically always contested the claims of the religious on the basis of certain notions. So if you look at developments within Europe, it's always contested religious authority. And that's where I would see that there is a very close connection with the question of the development of secularism in India, because, and sort of Anil Norya has documented Gandhi's work in detail on this, that the idea of secularism was precisely to also undermine claims in the name of religion. So for instance, if you take temple entry or any kinds of movements that you had in the context of caste, secular, it was precisely because religion was recognized by the colonial state to have a form of authority. You needed a principle by way of which to question that. So that the entire history of caste movements or temple entry or access to public resources comes through an understanding of a critique of religious authority, which becomes in the independent state necessarily in that sense based on a principle like secularism. So when one goes back to the argument that I pointed out earlier, that it's not the idea that a critique of religious authority or to make the argument that you need justice for certain members within a religious community is not essential to secularism. I mean, I certainly have a different understanding there. And it's not, it's not that. So that is why, I mean, in the discussion, if anyone's interested, that's why we have a series of, there have been some very interesting works on caste in the last decade or so that have shown very clearly, historiographically, that those historical works that have argued in terms of, that are sometimes associated with this particular movement, post-colonial theory or subaltern studies, so I can name the historians in the course of discussion if anyone's interested, that these studies have taken popular movements and completely obscured the role of caste in these, in these movements. And so in that sense, the initial schema that's provided by the book, that you have a critique of the West, but you also need to have a sort of, find these internal concepts. The danger, of course, is that the critique of the West can also be a way of sort of concealing internal asymmetries and an internal functioning of power, and we see this very clearly in the context of caste. So the argument that the secular somehow misdirects caste is, I think, sort of contestable proposition. And finally, I'll just end with this Sarva, because I'm sort of out of time also, that the Sarva Dharma Sambhava, the issue there is, again, it has to do with what is the nature of the entity that is ensuring that everyone is treated equally. So the whole point about the secular is from what position are you treating religions equally? And the question, a lot of the studies that are through with cases, they emerge precisely in moments of conflict. It is it's conflict between religious communities or conflicts within a religious community that necessitates a principle like secularism. And that is the context I think we need to keep in mind. And finally, I would just say that the idea of religion, it's difficult for me to agree with the argument that religion, there are really no stakes, that is not the central problem. I mean, what we're going to witness soon in a couple of days, and I think the entire movement, say the Ram Janmabhoomi movement from the 80s to the 90s, the idea that there is a movement to establish a temple and making a set of arguments. Of course, it is political, but it is difficult to say that because it is political, it is not religious, or the fact that the appeal does not lie in something like religion. So, in that sense, to my mind, religion remains absolutely central, and one would have to confront that category one way or the other.